Hey there. Welcome back to the Sleepy Dread. I'm Ollie. Tonight, I've got a story that's been sitting in the back of my mind for a long time. It's called The Legend of Sleepy Hollow, and it was written by Washington Irving way back in 1820. This is my retelling of it. Same bones, same spirit, but in my own words. So settle in, get comfortable, pull the covers up, and let's go to a quiet valley in New York a long, long time ago. There was a valley tucked between hills along the Hudson River where the world seemed to move slower than everywhere else. The Dutch settlers who lived there called it Sleepy Hollow, and the name fit. The air hung heavy over the fields. The creek barely moved. Even the trees seemed drowsy, their branches drooping low over the water like they were half asleep themselves. In the mornings, mist clung to the ground like something that didn't want to let go. You could stand at the edge of a cornfield and watch it drift between the rows, slow and thick, until the sun burned it off sometime around 10. The birds sang differently there, softer, like they knew better than to make too much noise. And in the evenings, when the light turned gold and then amber and then gone, the whole valley seemed to exhale, sinking a little deeper into itself. It was the kind of place where nothing much happened, and that was fine with the people who lived there. They farmed. They went to church. They sat on their porches in the evening and listened to the crickets start up, one by one, until the whole hollow hummed with them. And they told stories. That was the thing about Sleepy Hollow. The people there loved their stories, ghost stories mostly, tales of things seen in the woods at night, of voices heard along the creek, of lights flickering in the old Dutch cemetery where the headstones leaned like crooked teeth. Every family had one. Every neighbor had seen something, or knew someone who had. But there was one story that sat above all the others. One that everybody knew. One that nobody laughed about. The Headless Horseman. They said he was a Hessian soldier, a mercenary, brought over from Germany to fight in the Revolutionary War. During one of the battles near Sleepy Hollow, a cannonball took his head clean off. They buried what was left of him in the churchyard, in the old cemetery by the wooden bridge. But he didn't stay buried. On certain nights, the people said he rode out from the cemetery on a black horse, tearing through the hollow like a storm. He carried his head under one arm, or sometimes balanced on the front of the saddle, and he rode hard, searching for something. Nobody agreed on what. Some said he was looking for his head. Others said he was looking for someone to take its place. The only thing everyone agreed on was this: if you saw him, you ran. And if you couldn't outrun him, you made for the bridge by the church. Because for whatever reason, the horseman never crossed that bridge. Once you were on the other side, you were safe. That was the story they told in Sleepy Hollow, and most of them believed it. Now, into this quiet, superstitious little valley came a man named Ichabod Crane. Ichabod was the new schoolteacher. He'd come from Connecticut, and he was a sight. Tall and impossibly thin, with long arms and longer legs, hands that dangled a mile out of his sleeves, and feet that might have served as shovels. His head was small and flat on top, with enormous ears, large glassy eyes, and a long nose that made his whole face look like a weather vane. He walked like a scarecrow that had been given the gift of motion, and wasn't entirely sure what to do with it. But Ichabod was sharp. He was educated, more than most people in the valley anyway, and he took his job seriously enough. He taught the children their letters and their sums in a one-room schoolhouse that smelled of chalk dust and old wood. He kept a birch switch on his desk, and he used it when he had to, though never on the children whose mothers were good cooks. Ichabod was strategic about these things, because the truth about Ichabod Crane was that he was always hungry, not just for food, though food was a big part of it. The man had an appetite that didn't match his frame. He could eat his way through a farmhouse kitchen and still have room for pie. But he was hungry for more than that. He wanted comfort, security, land, maybe. A wife who came with a good farm and a full pantry. And he was hungry for stories. That was the other thing about Ichabod. For all his education, for all his Connecticut practicality, the man was deeply, almost helplessly superstitious. He believed in ghosts the way other men believed in weather. They were just a fact of life. He read Cotton Mather's writings on witchcraft and took every word as gospel. On winter evenings, he'd sit with the old Dutch wives by the fire, listening to their tales of spirits and specters, while the wind pressed against the windows. Then he'd have to walk home. And those walks, those were something. The road from the farmhouses back to his lodgings wound through dark hollows and along stretches of woods where the trees grew close together overhead. Every rustling branch was a ghost. Every croaking frog was a warning. Every gust of wind through the hollow carried a voice he almost recognized. He'd sing psalm tunes to keep his courage up, loud, wavering, off-key, and the sound of his own voice in all that darkness only made things worse. His own imagination was his worst enemy. The darker the night, the more it fed on itself. And Sleepy Hollow, with its heavy air and its whispering trees and its endless ghost stories, was the worst possible place for a man like that. Or maybe the best, because Ichabod loved it. He ate those stories up the same way he ate everything else, greedily, and without stopping to wonder if they might do him harm. Now, there was a girl. There's always a girl. Her name was Katrina Van Tassel, and she was the only daughter of Baltus Van Tassel, who was one of the wealthiest farmers in the valley. The Van Tassel farm was the kind of place that made a man like Ichabod dizzy. Fields of wheat and corn stretching out in every direction, orchards heavy with fruit, a barn full of livestock, a kitchen, and this was the part that really got to Ichabod, a kitchen that never stopped producing food. Katrina herself was 18, rosy-cheeked and pretty, and she knew it. She was a bit of a flirt, if we're being honest. She wore short petticoats to show off her ankles, and she had a way of smiling at a man that made him feel like he was the only person in the room, even when he wasn't. Ichabod saw Katrina, and then he saw the farm, and then he saw himself living on that farm, married to Katrina, eating that food for the rest of his life. And from that moment on, he was gone. Completely, hopelessly gone. The problem was, he wasn't the only one. Brom Bones, that wasn't his real name. His real name was Abraham Van Brunt, but everybody called him Brom Bones, and nobody called him Abraham unless they wanted trouble. Brom was everything Ichabod wasn't. Broad-shouldered, strong, loud, reckless. He was the best horseman in the valley, and he knew it. He rode a horse called Daredevil that was as wild and untamable as he was. He was the kind of man who'd race you down a country road at midnight for the fun of it. The kind who'd put a fence across the road just to see who'd crash into it. He was also in love with Katrina Van Tassel. Brom had been courting her for a while, and most people in the valley assumed it was a done deal. Nobody challenged Brom Bones. Not openly, anyway. When his horse was tied up outside the Van Tassel house on a Sunday evening, Other suitors simply turned around and went home. But Ichabod didn't turn around. He had one advantage over Brom, and he used it. As the schoolteacher, he had a reason to visit the Van Tassel house. Katrina was technically one of his students, for singing lessons if nothing else. So Ichabod came and went, and Brom couldn't exactly throw him out without looking like a brute. And this, I think, is where things began to go wrong. Brom wanted to fight. He wanted to settle things the simple way. Fists, maybe a wrestling match. Something physical where his size and strength would end the argument quickly. But Ichabod wouldn't give him the satisfaction. The schoolteacher was too clever for that. He kept slipping in and out of the Van Tassel household like a cat, always polite, always proper, never giving Brom a reason to swing. So Brom did what he could. He played tricks. He smoked out the schoolhouse chimney during lessons. He taught a dog to howl whenever Ichabod tried to give singing instruction. He broke into the schoolhouse at night and turned everything upside down. He spread rumors. And through it all, Katrina smiled at both of them. Whether she actually loved either one, nobody could quite tell. She seemed to enjoy the attention. She seemed to enjoy the competition. And she kept them both coming back. Then came the night that changed everything. It was autumn. The harvest was in, and Baltus Van Tassel was throwing a party. The invitation reached Ichabod at the schoolhouse on a golden afternoon, and the effect was immediate. He dismissed his students early, spent an hour getting dressed, borrowing clothes, combing his hair, studying himself in a broken mirror, and then set out for the Van Tassel farm on a horse he'd borrowed from a farmer named Hans Van Ripper. The horse was called Gunpowder. Old, broken down, one-eyed. The two of them made quite a picture. Ichabod's long legs nearly dragging the ground, his sharp elbows jutting out like the wings of a grasshopper, his small hat perched on top of his head while his coat-tails flapped behind him in the wind. But Ichabod didn't care how he looked. He was thinking about the party, about the food, about Katrina. The road to the Van Tassel farm wound along the edge of the Tappan Zee, where the Hudson spread out wide and still. The sun was going down, painting the water in shades of copper and plum. Ichabod rode past fields of golden stubble, past orchards where the last apples clung to bare branches, past stone walls that had been there since before anyone could remember. The air smelled of wood smoke and fallen leaves. It was the kind of evening that makes you feel like the world is winding down, getting ready for the long sleep of winter. The Van Tassel farm that evening was something to see. Lanterns hung from the trees, throwing warm pools of light across the yard. The barn doors were thrown open, and inside the space had been cleared for dancing, the old wooden floor swept clean. You could hear the fiddle tuning up from halfway down the road. But the food was the thing. Tables bent under the weight of it. Doughnuts and crullers, fried golden and dusted with sugar. Honey cake, cut into thick slabs. Roasted pigs with apples in their mouths. Smoked ham and platters of roast chicken. Bowls of cream so thick a spoon would stand up in them. Preserves, quince, plum, peach, ginger, and the pies. Apple pies, peach pies, pumpkin pies, lined up like they were waiting to be judged at a county fair. Ichabod's eyes went wide, and they stayed that way. He ate. Lord, he ate. He moved from dish to dish like a man on a mission, his long neck bobbing, his jaw working. He ate the way a man eats when he believes every bite is a preview of his future life. And he danced. He danced with Katrina while Brom Bones sat in the corner, sulking, his arms folded across his broad chest. Ichabod was not a graceful dancer, but what he lacked in form he made up for in enthusiasm. He flung his long limbs around the room, and Katrina laughed, and the fiddle played, and for one brief evening, Ichabod Crane felt like the luckiest man in the valley. But the night wasn't over. As the dancing wound down, the older men gathered near the fire. The air had turned cool. Outside, the trees were black against a sky with no moon. And the stories started. Ghost stories. The currency of Sleepy Hollow. Someone told of a woman in white who haunted the dark glen near Raven Rock. Someone else spoke of a funeral procession seen crossing the valley on a winter night. Silent, pale, vanishing into the mist before it reached the cemetery. And then, inevitably, they talked about the Horseman. Brom Bones had a story. He said he'd met the Horseman himself one night, on the road near the church. Said he'd challenged him to a race, and Daredevil had nearly won. But the Horseman vanished in a flash of fire as they reached the bridge. Brom told the story with a grin, but nobody else was grinning. Ichabod listened to all of it, every word. He sat in the firelight with his long legs crossed, his large eyes growing larger, soaking it all in. And his imagination, that terrible, wonderful, traitorous imagination, started to work. The party broke up late. The other guests departed in groups, their voices fading down the road, their lanterns winking out one by one. But Ichabod stayed behind. He had something to say to Katrina. What exactly passed between them, nobody knows. But when Ichabod came out of the Van Tassel house, his face was different. He looked stricken, deflated. Whatever he'd hoped to hear, he hadn't heard it. He climbed onto old Gunpowder and rode out into the night alone. The road home was dark. Not just dark, heavy with darkness. The kind of dark that has weight and texture and seems to press in from every side. The cheerful noise of the party was gone. The lanterns were gone. The music, the laughter, the warmth of all those bodies in one room, gone. It was just Ichabod and Gunpowder and the road was not friendly at this hour. The stories from the party were still churning in his head. The woman in white, the funeral procession, the Horseman. He couldn't stop thinking about them. Every sound in the woods made his heart jump. The snap of a twig, the hoot of an owl, sudden and close. The creek murmuring somewhere in the blackness below the road. A branch creaking in the wind, slow and deliberate, like a door being opened by someone who didn't want to be heard. Ichabod hunched his shoulders and tried to make himself small, which, given his dimensions, was not really possible. He rode past the old tulip tree where Major Andre had been captured during the war. It was enormous, its trunk wider than a man could reach around, its branches twisted and gnarled against the sky. People said that tree was haunted too. Ichabod whistled as he passed it, a thin, wavering psalm tune that sounded more like a plea than a song. He came to the brook near Wiley's swamp, and Gunpowder stopped. Just stopped. Planted his hooves and wouldn't move. Ichabod kicked, clucked, urged. The horse stood there, trembling. Then Ichabod saw something in the shadows. A shape. Large, dark, motionless. Crouched at the base of a tree on the far side of the brook. Ichabod's throat went dry. He called out, his voice cracking. No answer. He called again. Nothing. The shape moved. It rose up from the darkness and became a horseman. Enormous. Mounted on a horse that was black and powerful, and breathing steam into the cold air. The rider was cloaked in darkness, and when Ichabod strained his eyes to make out the figure's head, there was no head. The rider was holding something against the front of the saddle, something round and pale, Ichabod didn't wait to get a better look. He kicked Gunpowder hard, and the old horse lurched forward, and the chase began. Down the road they went, Ichabod and Gunpowder, and behind them, keeping pace, the dark rider on the dark horse. Ichabod crouched low in the saddle, his coattails flying, his heart hammering so loud he could hear it over the hooves. The saddle girth was loose. He could feel himself sliding, and in the panic he lost a stirrup, then nearly lost his seat entirely as Gunpowder lurched sideways to avoid a rut in the road. He tried to pull away. Gunpowder was old, but fear gave the horse a burst of speed they both needed. They tore through a stand of trees, branches whipping at Ichabod's face, and he could hear the other horse just behind him, not falling back, not gaining, just keeping pace, matching him stride for stride, like it wasn't even trying. Then Ichabod remembered. The bridge. Everyone said the horseman couldn't cross the bridge. If he could just reach the bridge by the church, he'd be safe. The church appeared ahead, its white walls ghostly in the darkness. The old cemetery spread out beside it, headstones pale and crooked in the gloom. The bridge was just beyond, the narrow wooden bridge over the brook. Ichabod could see it. Behind him, the hoofbeats were getting louder. He leaned forward. He urged Gunpowder on. The bridge was close, 30 yards, 20-10. Gunpowder's hooves hit the wooden planks of the bridge, and Ichabod felt a surge of desperate hope. He turned in the saddle to look back, expecting to see the horseman pulling up, refusing to cross. But the horseman was not pulling up. The dark rider rose in his stirrups, and with a terrible force, he hurled the thing he'd been carrying. It sailed through the air, and it struck Ichabod Crane square in the head with a sound like a melon breaking. And then there was darkness. The next morning, old Gunpowder was found grazing calmly by his master's gate. There was no sign of Ichabod. A search party followed the road to the bridge. The tracks told a story. 2 sets of hoof prints, side by side, tearing down the road toward the church. They ended at the bridge. On the far side, they found Ichabod's hat in the dirt, trampled, and beside it, lying in the shallow water at the edge of the brook, smashed to pieces, a pumpkin. They searched the brook. They searched the woods on both sides. They dragged the deeper pools downstream. They never found Ichabod Crane. Not a boot, not a button, nothing. The schoolhouse sat empty. A new teacher was hired. Life in Sleepy Hollow went on the way it always had. Slow, quiet, heavy with the weight of old stories. Brom Bones married Katrina Van Tassel not long after. He moved into the Van Tassel farm, ate the Van Tassel food, and lived the life that Ichabod had dreamed about. And whenever anyone mentioned the schoolteacher's name, whenever someone brought up the story of that night, Brom would smile. Just a little. Just enough to make you wonder. The old wives of the valley said Ichabod was still alive, that he'd fled to another part of the country, become a lawyer or a politician. Somebody claimed to have seen him in New York City years later. But the people who lived near the bridge, the ones who walked that road at night, they told a different story. They said that on certain autumn evenings, when the wind came up and the trees groaned overhead, you could hear hoofbeats on the wooden bridge. And if you listened close, you could hear something else. A thin, reedy voice, singing a psalm tune, drifting out across the dark water and fading into nothing. And that's the story, the legend of Sleepy Hollow. One of the first ghost stories ever written in America, and still one of the best. Was it the Horseman? Was it Brom Bones in a cloak, with a pumpkin tucked under his arm? Irving never tells us. He leaves it sitting right there on the line between a ghost story and a prank, and he lets you decide. And I think that's what makes it last. The not knowing, the little smile on Brahm's face, the empty schoolhouse, the pumpkin smashed on the bank of the brook. Some stories end with answers. This one ends with a question. Thank you for listening tonight. I hope the valley is pulling you under by now. The heavy air, the murmuring creek, the slow roll of mist over those old Dutch farms. That's where I'd like to leave you. If you enjoyed this, hit subscribe. There are more stories coming, and I'd love to have you back. For now, close your eyes. Let the hollow take you. Good night.